It's just fantastic. Captain's log, subdates 220405.7. Apparently there is a prison lawyer attempting to get pedophiles' genitals reattached before they fully decompose. We here have decided to relocate that prison lawyer to an abattoir for mandatory body cavity searches. Trigger warning. James D. Clark, the perp inmate for the day, is a colossal prick, and his crimes are quite severe and deserving of a lengthy time within the ISO cubes. So consider this your fair warning, as the crimes concern an infant. Welcome everyone to the Halls of Injustice. Today we welcome inmate number 122 to the ISO cubes. His name is James Dean Clark, and he is going to be with us for quite some time. The plan for today is to simply go through who he is, the crimes he committed, the charges, because he is not the only person who is charged with something here, the law, the trial, and the sentence. So first, let us now discuss who James Dean Clark is. James Dean Clark is a 31-year-old man that is not to be confused with the James Dean Clark mass murderer from Arizona who was executed in 1993. I know, not brought back from the dead. Necromancy isn't real, apparently. This James Dean Clark is a 31-year-old man from Warmley, Gloucestershire. He was in a relationship with a woman called Helen Jeremy, who was from Kingswood, so that their relationship had time to blossom, grow, and because no doubt they couldn't get a place together. Although I'm sure it's also possible they had a fractured relationship, but I doubt it. James lived with his mother in Warmley. Helen lived with her parents in Kingswood. On the weekends, they would spend time with each other at each other's respective parents' homes, alternating which one it would be. Eventually, at the end of 2017, they welcomed a son together called Sean. Sean is the victim of what we're going to be discussing today. You might notice now a complete lack of any coverage concerning occupation. That is because there is no news coverage as to what James Dean Clark did. As he lived at home with his mother though, one can surmise he was a bum dosser nobody that had no work. Or he was saving up to buy himself a dream home. He's got one now, by the way. It's called prison. So next, the crimes of James Dean Clark. We shall also during that discuss Helen Jeremy's involvement, as it is relevant. For the crimes committed by James Dean Clark, we go back to January the 11th, 2018. Helen Jeremy and Sean had gone to stay at Clark's home for the weekend. Mere hours after they had arrived, Helen Jeremy was using her phone to search on Google about babies coughing up blood, an early indicator that something was awry. She also sent her mother text messages indicating concerns for Sean's welfare because he was crying a lot, particularly when he was picked up and during feeding. On Sunday the 14th of January 2018, this is where things went wrong. James Dean Clark, because his son was making noise, had gone into his baby's room. His baby was 39 days old, for those who don't know. He had gone into that room to make his son be a bit quiet. Because holding, hugging, and being a bit patient was out of the question, he decided to shake Sean vigorously, viciously, repeatedly, and then returned him to his cot. Not long after, Helen Jeremy went to check on her son because no noise was coming from the room, to discover that her son was unresponsive. Emergency services were called, but sadly, Sean had passed away. The police immediately started an investigation. James Dean Clark immediately indicated that he had done nothing wrong, and the same for Helen Jeremy. Both, though, were arrested, the investigation for which took 3.5 years to reach a conclusion, and there's a reason why. To this day, James Dean Clark is adamant he did nothing wrong. So the evidence and the trial itself had to rely on something very specific. You see, people lie all the time, but the science is a little harder to manipulate, especially if you're not that intelligent. So now, I'd like to talk about the charges they faced and the UK law associated with both charges, and then we will talk about the trial and what the forensic evidence said. The charge that Helen Jeremy faced that got her to court was the causing or allowing a child or vulnerable adult to die or suffer serious physical harm, which is derived from the Domestic Violence, Crime and Victims Act of 2004. The offence: 1. A person, D, is guilty of an offence if A. a child or vulnerable adult, V, dies as a result of the unlawful act of a person who was a member of the same household as V and had frequent contact with him. B. D was such a person at the time of that act. C. At that time there was significant risk of physical harm being caused to V by the unlawful act of such a person, and D. Either D was the person whose act caused, or D was or ought to have been aware of the risk mentioned in paragraph C. D failed to take such steps as he could reasonably have been expected to protect V from the risk, and the act occurred in circumstances of the kind that D foresaw or ought to have foreseen. 2. The prosecution does not have to prove whether it is the first alternative in subsection 1D or the second subparagraph that applies. And skipping down to 7 because that was the relevant part to what Helen Jeremy was charged with. A person guilty of an offence under this section is liable on conviction on indictment to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 14 years, or to a fine, or to both. 8. A person guilty of an offence under this section or causing or allowing a person to suffer serious physical harm is liable on conviction on indictment to imprison for a term not exceeding 10 years, or to a fine, or both. James Dean Clark was charged with something different. He was charged with murder, which falls under the Homicide Act of 1957. As you are all undoubtedly familiar with that particular law, I will specify that if found guilty of committing a murder, the sentence has to be life. It has to be. That is what UK law specifies. But I will put the Crown Prosecution Service's legal guidance on the screen so you can fully appreciate just how in-depth this law is and how screwed James Dean Clark is given the context and the gravity of the situation. So next I'd like to talk about the trial, because this is where some rather interesting information came to light, courtesy of forensic analysis and questioning from the prosecution. During the trial, James Dean Clark told the jury that fatherhood did not daunt him, being quoted as saying, "I liked it. I enjoyed it. I found some stuff quite difficult, but I got through it," further explaining that he had a compulsive nature and liked to have his possessions arranged just so, pointing out that this habit also applied to ensuring that Sean's milk was ready for him when Helen Jeremy visited with the baby from her mother's home where they lived. James Dean Clark also told the jury he enjoyed to play video games. When his barrister Andrew Langdon asked if he ever took out his frustration from gaming on Sean, he said that he did not. Both Helen Jeremy and James Dean Clark denied injuring the baby in any way, shape or form. During that same trial, we got the additional context from Helen Jeremy about the long weekend that they had spent together. This is where we get to the forensic evidence. A post-mortem was carried out on Sean, and it confirmed that he had suffered 74 rib fractures, some of which were very recent, others were beginning to heal, which indicated that over his rather short 39-day life, he had been subject to multiple abuses. He also had 2 severe head injuries, further indicating this was not accidental. Medical experts confirmed that his injuries were consistent with having been shaken violently shortly before his passing. While all this evidence was being presented, James Dean Clark was adamant that he had done nothing wrong. This is where I now insert. Helen Jeremy was acquitted of the charges she faced because the evidence did not support her having been responsible in any way for the death of her son. But the same cannot be said for James Dean Clark. Because of a lack of admission of guilt from James Dean Clark, the police had to prove beyond reasonable doubt that James Dean Clark was guilty. After 3.5 years, James Dean Clark was found guilty of murder. All the while maintaining his innocence, he was found guilty via unanimous decision. And it is with that in mind we get to a sentence and an update to that sentence. James Dean Clark, inmate 112, was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 15 years before being eligible for parole. This sentence, and this is where an update slides in, was deemed too lenient and was very recently updated to life with a minimum of 18 years. Anne Hampshire of the Crown Prosecution Service, upon the conviction being announced, said this was a tragic case where a very young child was the victim of several assaults. Only Clark knows exactly how Sean suffered those injuries, and he maintained that he was not the cause. This case relied on evidence from some of the top medical experts in the country and was distressing to investigate and for the jury to hear. The verdict demonstrates that the jury were satisfied that it was Clark who inflicted these injuries and they found him guilty of murder. Superintendent James Riccio of Avon and Somerset Police, after the conviction, said, "James Clark is responsible for the most repulsive and hideous of crimes, the murder of a defenseless child. The evidence showed quite clearly Sean was subjected to multiple assaults which had been committed on a number of separate occasions, and we fought hard to secure the charges and compile the evidence to put it in front of a court. As his father, he should have protected him, not inflict pain and suffering on him." As far as we at the Halls of Injustice are concerned, the sentence of life is life. No early option of getting out, no. You get to spend the remainder of your years a eunuch working on a mine on Titan. Congratulations. So as we have reached the end of this video, I would love to know what you all think. Please do let me know in the comments down below. And while I fully respect that this is quite a harrowing subject, please consider smashing the like as it really helps this channel. Thank you.